I once tried to add up how long we had lived in the post-Cold War, post-ideological combat utopia that came upon us in 1989, put an end to the long nuclear and ideological standoff under which I and many of you had grown up, appeared to inaugurate an era bodied forth principally by Frank Fukuyama, in which liberalism and democracy and pluralism and a version of the market economy would be not just the regnant, but in effect the only model for societies. There was talk of a peace dividend, if you recall. I'm sure someone must have said of swords and plowshares, though I don't actually remember it. Of turning our attention to the sufferings of our brothers and sisters in Africa, particularly, long neglected or subordinated to what appeared during the epoch to be larger concerns. Anyway, some of you will remember that euphoria. I calculated that if you date its beginning from an episode that I witnessed, which was the overthrow of the Nicolae Ceausescu regime in Romania between Christmas and New Year of 1989. If you date that as the end of one-man rule and one-party rule in Europe, then the period of euphoria and the new utopia lasted for about 111 days, after which Slobodan Milosevic invaded Bosnia and attempted to annex it to a greater Serbia. And Saddam Hussein did not invade Kuwait, as is often said, but annexed the state of Kuwait, an independent state, a member of the United Nations, of the non-aligned movement, of the Arab League, of the Conference of Islamic Governments, annexed it to be the 19th province of Iraq. At a time when we now know he had the choice of either developing his bomb before invading Kuwait or invading Kuwait and then getting additional financing for the bomb that he had underway. We didn't know it, but we were living in the hollow of his hand. We were also living at the pleasure of people like Slobodan Milosevic. While all this was going on, coming up on the inside track, as it might be said, in Afghanistan, and barely noticed by us, was a fusion of the idea of the one-man rule and the one-party rule with the one-God rule that makes this dictatorship even more iron and inflexible and menacing, because, like the others, it leads to failure, state failure, and like the other state failures, it will not blame itself for its failure, but will export its violence and blame conspiracies of others for its own collapse. And for me, the special symbol of that also took place in 1989, when the theocratic head of a foreign state who just lost a war with Saddam Hussein, the Ayatollah Khomeini, offered money in his own name for the purpose of the suborning of murder of a writer of fiction living in London who is not an Iranian citizen, a friend of mine by chance, named Salman Rushdie. Very radical challenge, I thought, to every possible value that's represented by the Western Enlightenment into a free expression. But it seems to me that the kind of muscle and sinew that people are going to need to have acquired to combat the new form of totalitarianism is the sort that some of us gradually, rather randomly and haphazardly, but gradually did acquire in realizing that the recrudescence of ethnic fascism in Europe had to be stopped, realizing that Saddam Hussein could not be allowed to get away with the destruction of another country, and that in the long run the existence of his regime, the coexistence with it, perhaps I should say, was impossible and undesirable for the United States and for the rest of the Superman as well. To realize that that the challenge from Islamism was mounting and becoming more and more bold and promiscuous, and being mounted much more in the streets and squares of our own societies. V-Day, the fatwa promulgated in London and Paris and New York against Salman Rushdie. This was the kind of, as I say, fibre one, now I look back on it, perhaps had to acquire to realize what was meant by the horror of the challenge of September the 11th. And it's nice to be in a room for once where people don't mind using the word war, even if elegantly shaded and nuanced, as by Bill, because where most of the time I have to spend my life is in places where people have been war-weary since the late afternoon of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. Now, what I don't think anyone has quite conveyed. I'm going to have a shot at it. What was the quality of that shot? Look, if you've been in Sarajevo, as I've been, if you've been and seen something of the Kuwait War and the war in northern Iraq and Kurdistan and so forth, I had done some of that. And frankly, the sight of seeing someone jumping in flames from a building isn't all that terrifying. The fact that it happens in America, I think it's narcissistic distress. That kind of thing happens in a war, has to be expected. If you're in a war, you're going to lose a building and a plane, and maybe a small town and a schoolroom. You should reckon about once every week. Get ready for it. That wasn't the shock to me. The shock to me was this. The president went missing for a whole day and crept back to Washington and made a craven speech written by Karen Hughes that he should have retracted by now. That we were left under open skies by NORAD. That we were betrayed by our intelligence agencies, the CIA and the FBI, who hadn't bothered to realize that incubated in our own society was the deadliest of enemies. That these enemies were further incubated by two state systems, that of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, who we've been educated by our elite to consider as friends, as moderates. A gigantic betrayal on a historic and colossal scale, accompanied by the most appalling impotence. I can't forget how helpless the country felt that day, and how abandoned it was, and I never shall. I don't think anyone ought to be able to, or be allowed to. All of you, I'm sure, read Mr. Woodward's book on, the two books on the origins of the war and the consequences of it, where he relies very heavily on Mr. George Tenet of the Central Intelligence Agency. I'll make this my encapsulating anecdote, if you like. You can always tell who's helped Bob Woodward, because if you're described as the aspirant, tough-minded son of hard-scrabbled Greek immigrants, you're one of his sources. That's the case with George Tenet in this case, and there are other reasons why he gets good treatment and why his quotations are put in quotation marks, quite a rare privilege from Wardiana. Well, we know what the first remark made by the director of our Central Intelligence was in the immediate post-9/11 epoch, the first few seconds of it actually, because we know what he said when the men ran in to tell him, Mr. Director, you better leave this meeting with Senator Boren. And it wasn't because he was late for his next one. He had to watch on the television what had happened. And his first remark made by our intelligence establishment in this era we're now in was the following. Gee, said Mr. Tenet, I hope it's nothing to do with those guys in the flight schools in the Midwest. Does this man deserve a Medal of Freedom, do you think, on his retirement? Should he not rather have been impeached? Should he not have at least been dismissed? Should he not, in fact, probably have been prosecuted for criminal negligence? No, because it must not be admitted. Therefore, it's left for us to face the fact that this is an army fight. It's going to need volunteers. We cannot, in fact, delegate this to our leaders or complain when they get it wrong. It's going to call upon us. And the moment I want to reach is when in the Arab press you start to read worried articles saying, do you realize that our extremist policies of terrorism and so are creating huge forces of resistance in the West? We've really driven them now to a point where they're ready to fight. People all over the United States are signing up, saying, what can I do? How can I push back against jihad? Now look what we've done with our intervention in their internal affairs. That's when I'll know that we've turned this round. And do you feel, any of you, any sign of any of this mentality? Or self-respect or dignity in our society? I don't. But that's what I think we have to learn how to fight for. And we know who the enemy is. I'm not going to waste much time on that. The vile combination in Islam of self-righteousness and self-hatred and self-pity. It's Trinity that we see every day. It's wrong for the president, it was wrong then for him to call it an attack on America, to say that we were either with us, the Americans, or with the terrorists. There were 80 nations represented in those towers that day. Several hundred of my fellow countrymen among them. I refused to go to a ceremony, especially for people of English descent, because I didn't want to go to anyone's national or ethnic celebration. It was an attack on civilization itself, that should be very plain. And we should be very careful, I'm sorry, sir, to correct you slightly, of saying we have not been attacked since, because if we take that stand of civilization, we have been attacked almost every single day since then.